the grim milestone of 1 year of the ongoing Russia invasion. On February 24, 2022, the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a military operation. No one had predicted a long-drawn war. Ukraine was expected to be run over. That hasn't happened, as its people mounted a commendable resistance. This is the first war in the heart of Europe after World War II. Within a few weeks of the conflict, neighboring countries, the European Union, had to open up their borders for hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the violence. Western nations have imposed widespread sanctions on Moscow, including stopping transactions with Russia's central bank, banning new investment and freezing the assets of Russian political and business leaders. Russia was forced to scale back its war goals following stiff resistance from Ukrainian forces, and it eventually switched focus to the Donbas region, where Moscow-backed separatists launched a rebellion in 2014. The conflict, remember, escalated the global food crisis over the past 1 year, as Ukraine's government announced a ban on a wide range of agricultural exports, causing world food prices to reach a record high in March. But the human loss of this war has been catastrophic. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on countries to help him set up a fund to rebuild his nation. Let's take a look at the cost of this war. How has it affected both Russia and Ukraine? For example, Ukraine's GDP is now down by 30% since last quarter, while Russia's GDP is expected to shrink by $190 billion by 2026. Ukraine's budget deficit stands at 27%, Russia's at just 2% of the GDP, despite towering spending and slumping energy revenues. It is set to slump further unless prices for Russian oils recover. The damage caused to Ukraine's physical housing facilities has been estimated to cost over $137 billion, while Russia has spent over $82 billion on this invasion. As of today, the cost to replace Ukraine's damaged infrastructure and economy will cost $350 billion, estimated by the World Bank, while Western sanctions and restrictions have blocked Russia's foreign reserves worth $300 billion. The ongoing conflict has been brutal, shows no signs of stopping anytime soon, which is the biggest worry. As of this week, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded around 21,293 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with over 13,000 injuries. Over 180,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives, over 1 lakh soldiers from the Ukrainian side as well, which makes the total lives lost on the battlefield to 280,000. As a result of the war, nearly 1/3 of the population of Ukraine remains forcibly displaced, making it one of the largest displacements crises in the world. According to the UNHRC, for refugees, between 10 to 13 million Ukrainians have been displaced internally and across the borders. Let's take a look, though, of what this war has achieved for Russia, for example. This is how Ukraine looked before and now. The map on the left is of Ukraine before the invasion. The right one shows the Ukrainian territories taken by Russia, along with areas which were later reclaimed by Ukraine. Heavy fighting still continues in Crimea, in Bakhmut, along with other areas near the Donbas region. What has Russia really achieved after 1 year of this conflict? And where is this conflict really heading for both sides? That's the big debate that's coming up with our special guest joining us. Fred Beer is a journalist and expert on Russian affairs. I'm also joined by Dr. Lada L. Rozlicki, security analyst, joining us from Ukraine. I'd want to go across to Dr. Lada first up. It's been 1 year. It's created absolute havoc in the life of Ukrainians. Where do you see this conflict heading? Because the biggest worry in the minds of everyone around the world is that there seems to be no end in sight?
Well, it's heading to a very important crescendo where either the civilized world and their citizens stand up against the evil that the Kremlin is spreading, together with its international global corrupt network, and we face a potential life on planet Earth led by kleptocratic maniacs, or we cooperate and really give effect to the institutions that have been created after the Second World War. We operate with dignity in accordance with a vision of a future that will prevent genocide and really address things what they are in the future before such atrocities can happen again. Because what is happening and continues to happen in Ukraine every single day is simply atrocious and unthinkable.
Yeah. I do want to ask you, though, before I go across to our Russian guest, is, the world, especially some of the Western powers, are very ably supporting your fight back, and Ukrainian forces have held very strongly. I just want to get a sense from you, given if you take it that Russia is not going to stop, how long do you think your forces can maintain a wall?
Well, if we're just talking about a military aid perspective, it is important to recognize that the Ramstein group consists of over 42 countries. So it's not just the United States, as the Russians like to put forth, because they're pushing to say that this is a war between Russia and America. Well, hello, what does Ukraine have to do in that, should that narrative be true? Now, to answer your question, how much time? Russia is using their men as fodder on the front line. So there is a very serious problem with artillery, munitions on both sides. That having been said, the Ukrainians do not have men to throw as cannon fodder on the front lines the way that Russia does. And that it poses a very, very serious problem as to what type of technology can be used in order to prevent this high level of barbaric killing of innocent men who don't know each other for in the name of greed and this empire building that Putin is so fixated on.
Okay. Fred, where I want to bring you in, if we look at the noises coming in from Vladimir Putin and Russia, there seems to be no abating in what they believe is their reason and their purpose of this conflict. Why is that so? Because Russia was not possibly imagining that they would be mired in this conflict for a year, and there is still no end in sight.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not Russian. I'm a foreign correspondent based in Russia. But I have been here for more than 3 decades, and I've been following everything for all that time. So this war is of course, a serious departure. It was probably predictable back in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. Those kinds of transitions seldom historically happen peacefully. And this is, in many ways, a post-imperial conflict. And it has been turned into a kind of global struggle between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy. And this obscures what might have been possibilities for having prevented it in the first place or having resolved it earlier. But we're now truly into it. And Putin's argument to the Russian people the other day was, it's become an existential struggle for Russia, not against Ukraine, but against the United West. And I'm sorry to report that majorities of Russians seem to sort of accept that. Not with great enthusiasm, but also not with fear. You know, this is a motivational thing. And what I see is Russian society consolidating, the Russian economy mobilizing, going onto a war footing. I really fear that this war can go on unless, as your other guest said, the international community steps in and seriously promotes negotiated settlement of some sort.
But those are not forthcoming, isn't it? We've seen more and more very confrontational statements coming in from world leaders. I know some are trying to bring all sides onto the table, but it's almost like there's no hope of that anymore.
It doesn't look very hopeful. You're absolutely right about that. It looks terrible. From both Moscow and Kyiv, we hear like absolutely uncompromising rhetoric. I do think, I mean, realistically, I do think there are momentous events going to happen on the battlefield. That's where the preconditions for peace, sad to say, are going to be established. But we do have some movement from China, for example, putting forward a plan. If other countries can get behind that plan, certainly the Chinese have a good deal of leverage in Moscow, and this is possible. We have to keep on hoping, because what's happening down there is a horror.
Absolutely.
It's a daily monstrous. It just, I wake up every morning in dread, and go to sleep every evening fearing for what tomorrow will bring. So let's hope for peace.
Yeah. Dr. Rosliki, I want to ask you, since you mentioned this, that, Russia obviously believes very firmly that Ukraine is just a tool for US to fight its war with Russia. And this is effectively a US-Russia war. Since you mentioned that, I do want to ask you, this is something that is said about the start of the war and has been said consistently for 1 year, that US almost pushed Ukraine towards this fight. It used Ukraine for its own agenda versus Russia. Do you believe there is any kind of thinking amongst Ukrainians that this could have been avoidable?
Yes, absolutely. It could have been avoidable had the West taken the proper stance in the war in Chechnya that started in the 90s. I agree with your guest that this is something that is crawling, and the Russian strategic separatism that we see being supported in the Black Sea region in countries that want to be democracies, Georgia, for instance, and Moldova. Then we have that Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These are all territories that Russia is spending significant money on in order to continue developing or recreating its empire. So it's not so much a geopolitical fight as it is a civilizational. It is the type of societies in which we want to live in. And of course, the Western states, we have no illusion that it's perfect there, but the rule of law does tend to work, and the justice systems there do tend to work much better than the justice system that is so known to the Kremlin, which is basically a control bullet in the head if you do something that the dictator says is wrong.
Okay, I have to leave it at that. Unfortunately, nobody really seems to know where this conflict is heading, when it could end, if peace is around the corner. But I do thank both of our guests for joining us, and we do wish the Ukrainians support and all the best as far as this fight back is concerned. On that note, let me also play out some ground reports from Ukraine. My colleague Sanjay Suri has been bringing us some pictures of the reality of the war-torn country.
It's been a year since the destruction began, and no one is forgetting. There's just too much of it still around, and at any time there can be more. Here and there, some people are repairing and rebuilding as they can, with some help if they are lucky. But on scale, this is really like trying to stick a shred of Band-Aid over multiple wounds. Most homes hit a year back and since have stayed hit. Those who survived have not returned. There is nothing to come back to, no money to build these burnt-out shells of what was home. This was the home of a famous Ukrainian boxer killed in the missile attack here. Unlikely as it now seems, these housing blocks just outside Kyiv were the scene of a fierce battle between Ukrainians and Russian paratroopers who landed here.
Russians occupied all of these buildings and they were shooting on our soldiers from these buildings, from the top of the buildings. Russia has stationed their tanks around the buildings.
The neighborhood presents a happy spin now over parachutes. Around the blocks, some repair has been carried out, but patchily. A rocket landed in the playground. Children now simply play around the crater. This is the campus of the Taras Shevchenko University, the biggest university in Ukraine. This is not what a campus should look like. You'd expect students buzzing about the place. This is a working day through term time. But this campus has been hit by missiles, hit by absence. A lot of the teaching and the studying is now online. Certainly, no one needs to teach the students what war can mean. It has meant missile attacks on campus, one after the other, at a university once a magnet to students from around the world. Windows are boarded up, the campus deserted, the corridors look ghostly, the classrooms are empty, the notice board in the common room outdated, its chairs stacked away.
Time for a very short break. On the other side, US President Joe Biden nominates Indian origin Ajay Banga for World Bank chief post. We'll get you more about the man in just a bit.
Didn't control the